In the quiet glow of your screen tonight, ancient questions whisper through modern circuits. Welcome back to Sleepy Tech Stories, where we explore the gentle mysteries of our digital world. I'm your host, and tonight we're continuing our peaceful journey through the Matrix Decoded series. Have you ever wondered what makes something real? Tonight, we'll drift through a story that spans over 2,000 years. A story about shadows and light, about dreams that became reality, about the eternal human question that has guided our greatest innovations. So settle in, breathe deeply, and let yourself relax. We're about to take a gentle journey from ancient Greek caves to the digital worlds that surround us today. A journey where philosophy meets technology, where ancient wisdom guides modern innovation, and where the line between real and imagined becomes beautifully blurred. Close your eyes if you'd like. Let the story wash over you like a warm tide, and let's begin. Picture, if you will, the warm Mediterranean sun setting over ancient Athens. The year is 380 before Common Era. Golden light spills across marble steps, and in a quiet corner of the academy, a philosopher named Plato is about to tell a story. It's a simple story about prisoners, about shadows, about the gentle revelation that what we think is real might be just the beginning. Imagine these prisoners chained gently in a cave since birth, not cruelly, but simply. There they face a wall. Behind them, a fire flickers warmly, and between the fire and the prisoners, people carry objects, everyday things, a cup, a flower, a bird. The prisoners see only shadows dancing on the wall, soft, moving shapes that tell stories without words. To them, these shadows are reality itself. They've never known anything else. The shadows are beautiful, familiar, comforting. They develop names for the shadows. They create stories about their movements. They find patterns in their dance. Over the years, they become experts in the language of shadows, able to predict which shape will appear next, which movement will follow another. But then, one prisoner is freed. Slowly, gently, he turns around. The fire's warmth touches his face for the first time. The light hurts, but not harshly. It's just new, overwhelming in its brightness. The real objects seem strange, less familiar than the shadows he's always known. A wooden cup casts the shadow he knew as the curved one. A clay bird creates the flying shape. The disconnect is profound. These solid, three-dimensional objects seem less real than their familiar shadows. They're harder to understand, more complex, more confusing. When he's led outside, the sunlight is even more intense. But gradually, his eyes adjust. He sees trees swaying in the breeze, clouds drifting across an endless sky. A world so much larger, so much more beautiful than the cave he's always called home. The colors are overwhelming. The shadows in the cave were simple black shapes on a warm, flickering wall. But here, light creates infinite variations. Green leaves that shimmer silver in the breeze, blue sky that deepens to purple at the horizon, golden sunlight that makes everything glow with inner fire. He discovers that the sun itself is the source of all light, all shadows, all vision. That the fire in the cave was just a pale imitation of this greater illumination. That the objects in the cave were themselves just copies of the perfect forms that exist in this upper world. When he returns to tell the others, they don't believe him. How could they? The shadows are real to them, comfortable, known. His story of a larger world seems impossible, even frightening. They prefer their familiar darkness to his blinding revelations. They might even become angry with him, Plato suggests. They might try to silence him, to prevent him from disturbing their comfortable illusions. The truth, when it challenges everything we think we know, can be more threatening than any lie. Now, you might wonder, why begin a story about computers with ancient philosophy? Because Plato understood something profound, something that would echo through the centuries and eventually inspire the very technologies we use today to question reality itself. He understood that questioning reality isn't just an intellectual exercise. It's a deeply human impulse, a gentle curiosity that drives us to look beyond what we think we know. Plato's cave isn't just about ancient prisoners. It's about the fundamental human experience of discovering that our perceived reality might be incomplete, that there might be layers of truth beyond what our senses immediately reveal, that the courage to question what seems obvious can lead to profound revelations. This insight would prove to be one of the most important ideas in human history. The recognition that reality might have multiple layers, that what seems solid and certain might be just shadows of something deeper, would eventually inspire scientists, philosophers, and technologists to push beyond the boundaries of the obvious. Fast forward through time, across centuries and continents, to a small room in the Netherlands, where another philosopher sits by a flickering fire. The year is 1641. His name is Descartes. Descartes was troubled by a beautiful question. How can we know that anything we experience is truly real? Our dreams feel real while we're dreaming. Our memories can deceive us. Even our senses sometimes lie. He had experienced this uncertainty firsthand. Dreams so vivid they seemed more real than waking life. Memories that felt absolutely true until proven false. Optical illusions that showed him how easily his senses could be fooled. So Descartes imagined something extraordinary. What if there existed a being of immense power, not evil exactly, but mischievous, a being that could create perfect illusions, that could make you believe you have hands when you have none, that could show you a world that exists only in your mind. In this imagined scenario, everything you think you know could be an elaborate dream. The chair you're sitting in, the room around you, even your own body, all could be nothing more than beautiful, convincing illusions. This wasn't just a thought experiment for Descartes. It was a lived experience of doubt. He had felt the ground of certainty slip away beneath his feet, had experienced the vertigo of realizing that everything he thought he knew might be questionable. Sound familiar? Descartes had essentially described the Matrix 3.5 centuries before it appeared on movie screens. But Descartes found something unshakable in this sea of doubt. Even if everything else was illusion, the very fact that he could think, that he could doubt, proved something real existed. I think, therefore I am, he whispered into the quiet night. This wasn't just a logical conclusion, it was an existential anchor. In a world where everything might be illusion, the experience of consciousness itself remained undeniably real. The act of questioning, of doubting, of thinking, these couldn't be faked or simulated. They were the bedrock of existence. Descartes realized that consciousness was self-proving. You can doubt the existence of your body, your surroundings, your memories, but you cannot doubt the existence of the doubter. The very act of questioning proves that something real is doing the questioning. This insight would prove crucial for our digital age. As we create more sophisticated simulations, As we build artificial intelligences and virtual realities, the question of consciousness remains central. What makes an experience real? What makes a mind genuine? What distinguishes authentic awareness from clever imitation? Across the world, in the gentle wisdom of the East, similar questions bloomed like flowers in spring. Hindu philosophers spoke of Maya, a beautiful veil of illusion that covers ultimate reality, not to deceive, but to teach, to guide us toward deeper understanding. Maya wasn't seen as something evil or false. It was understood as a natural part of existence, like the way a dream feels real while you're dreaming it. The goal wasn't to destroy Maya, but to see through it, to understand its nature, to recognize the deeper reality it both conceals and reveals. This concept of layered reality, of truth hidden behind appearances, would prove remarkably similar to our modern understanding of how perception works. Our brains don't passively receive reality, they actively construct it, filtering and interpreting sensory data to create our experience of the world. Buddhist teachers described the world of appearances as like a dream, not false exactly, but temporary, shifting, less solid than it seems. They spoke of the emptiness of phenomena, not meaning that nothing exists, but that things don't exist in the solid, permanent way they appear to. This wasn't nihilism. It was a profound insight into the nature of experience. Everything we perceive is real as experience, but the way we interpret that experience as solid, permanent, separate is a construction of our minds. And in ancient China, a philosopher named Zhuangzi told a story that still makes us smile. He dreamed he was a butterfly, fluttering freely through a garden. When he woke, he wondered, am I a man who dreamed of being a butterfly, or am I a butterfly dreaming I'm a man? Zhuangzi's question wasn't just playful. It pointed to something profound about the nature of identity and reality. If both experiences, being a man, being a butterfly, feel equally real while you're having them, what makes one more true than the other? This question would prove remarkably prescient in our age of virtual reality and digital identity. When we can have meaningful experiences in virtual worlds, when we can form real relationships through digital avatars, when we can learn and grow and change through simulated experiences, what makes these less real than physical experiences? All of these gentle thinkers shared something beautiful. They understood that questioning reality isn't about destroying our sense of what's real. It's about expanding it, about recognizing that there might be more to existence than what we immediately perceive. They weren't trying to prove that nothing is real. They were trying to understand what reality really means. They were exploring the relationship between appearance and truth, between experience and existence, between the world as it seems and the world as it is. They couldn't have known that thousands of years later, their questions would inspire engineers and programmers, that their philosophical curiosity would guide the creation of artificial worlds so convincing. We'd need to ask their questions all over again. But perhaps that's the most beautiful part of this story. The questions that kept ancient philosophers awake by candlelight are the same questions that guide our digital age, the human desire to understand, to explore, to imagine. It's timeless. These ancient insights would prove to be more than just philosophical curiosities. They would become the conceptual foundation for our greatest technological achievements. The recognition that reality might have multiple layers would inspire the creation of artificial layers. The understanding that consciousness constructs experience would guide the development of technologies that could construct new experiences. The courage to question what seems obvious would eventually lead to the creation of worlds that seem impossible. And so, with these ancient questions as our gentle guide, let's journey forward through time to the moment when humans first began creating artificial worlds of their own. Let's drift now to a place where desert winds whisper across ancient mesas, Los Alamos, New Mexico. The year is 1946. The war has ended, but a new age is beginning. An age where human imagination would learn to speak in the language of mathematics, in a room filled with the gentle clicking and humming of the ENIAC computer. Two brilliant minds are about to create something unprecedented. Stanislaw Ulam and John von Neumann. Their names sound like poetry, don't they? Ulam was a Polish mathematician who had fled Europe during the war. He had a gift for seeing patterns in chaos, for finding order in randomness. Von Neumann was a Hungarian polymath, one of the most brilliant minds of his generation. Together, they would create the first artificial reality. They faced a beautiful problem. They needed to understand how tiny particles behave in nuclear reactions, but they couldn't exactly set off atomic bombs to gather data. Too dangerous, too destructive. So they did something extraordinary. They created a world inside the computer, a mathematical world where particles could dance safely, where they could explore the behavior of matter without the matter itself. The problem they were trying to solve was incredibly complex. When neutrons collide with atomic nuclei, they can be absorbed, reflected, or cause the nucleus to split. Each interaction is governed by probability. You can't predict exactly what will happen to any individual neutron, but you can understand the statistical behavior of millions of them. Traditional mathematical approaches couldn't handle this complexity. The equations were too difficult, the variables too numerous. But Ulam had an insight. What if they could simulate the random behavior of individual particles, then observe the patterns that emerged from millions of these random interactions? They called their method Monte Carlo, after the famous casino, because, like rolling dice, it relied on chance, on probability, on the gentle randomness that underlies all existence. The ENIAC was enormous. It filled an entire room, weighed 30 tons, used more electricity than a small town. Its vacuum tubes glowed like tiny suns, and the heat they generated required massive cooling systems. Programming it required physically rewiring connections, a process that could take days. Yet the world it created existed only as numbers, as mathematical relationships flowing through vacuum tubes like thoughts through a dreaming mind. This was humanity's first artificial reality, not made of atoms, but of pure information. And yet, it could reveal truths about the physical universe that no amount of direct observation could uncover. The Monte Carlo simulations were remarkably successful. They could predict the behavior of nuclear reactions with unprecedented accuracy. They could explore scenarios too dangerous to test in reality. They could answer questions about the fundamental nature of matter by creating mathematical worlds where matter didn't exist. It was a profound moment. The first hint that sometimes the best way to understand reality is to create an artificial one. But the implications went far beyond nuclear physics. Ulam and von Neumann had demonstrated something revolutionary, that computers could create worlds, not just calculate numbers or process data, but generate entire environments where complex systems could evolve and interact. This insight would prove to be one of the most important discoveries of the computer age. The recognition that digital systems could simulate not just individual objects or processes, but entire realities, complete with their own laws and behaviors. Time flows forward like a gentle river. We find ourselves now at MIT in the year 1963, in a laboratory where the future is being born, one pixel at a time. A young man named Ivan Sutherland sits before a computer screen. It's small, circular, about the size of a dinner plate. The computer itself, a Lincoln TX2, fills several rooms and costs more than most people's houses. In his hand, he holds something that looks like a thick pencil connected to the computer by a cable. He calls it a light pen. Sutherland was working on his PhD thesis, but what he was creating would change the world. He was trying to solve a problem that seemed simple, but was actually revolutionary. How could humans communicate directly with computers? At the time, computers were programmed with punch cards and paper tape. You would write your program, convert it to holes in cards, feed the cards to the computer, and wait hours or days for results. There was no direct interaction, no immediate feedback, no sense of conversation between human and machine. As he touches the pen to the screen, something magical happens. Lines appear, not printed lines, not drawn lines, but lines made of light itself. He can move them, reshape them, copy them. For the first time in history, a human being is directly manipulating objects that exist only as patterns of light. He calls his creation Sketchpad, but it's so much more than a drawing program. It's the first interactive virtual environment, the first place where human intention could directly shape digital reality. Sketchpad could do things that seemed impossible. You could draw a line, then tell the computer to make it perfectly horizontal. You could create a shape, then duplicate it instantly. You could define relationships between objects. Make this line always perpendicular to that one. Keep these shapes always the same size, and the computer would maintain those relationships automatically. Students and faculty gather around Sutherland's screen, mesmerized. They're watching the birth of a new kind of reality, one that exists in the space between human consciousness and electronic computation. One visitor described watching Sutherland work as like seeing someone perform magic. Objects appeared and disappeared at will. Complex drawings could be created, modified, and perfected with gestures that seemed to bend the laws of physics. But Sutherland wasn't satisfied with just manipulating objects on a flat screen. He had a bigger vision. What if you could step inside the computer-generated world? What if you could surround yourself with artificial reality so completely that your senses would accept it as real? This wasn't just a technical challenge, it was a philosophical one. Sutherland was asking whether human consciousness could be convinced to accept artificial environments as real spaces, whether the boundary between physical and digital reality could be crossed. In 1968, he builds something that looks like it belongs in a medieval castle, heavy, mechanical, suspended from the ceiling by a metal arm. They call it the Sword of Damocles because of its imposing presence. The device was crude by today's standards. The displays were tiny cathode ray tubes, one for each eye. The tracking system used mechanical linkages and potentiometers. The graphics were generated by custom hardware that could only draw simple wireframe shapes. But when you strap this contraption to your head, something wonderful happens. You find yourself inside a simple wireframe world, just white lines on a black background, forming basic geometric shapes. Yet when you turn your head, the world turns with you. When you move forward, you move through the digital space. For the first time in human history, someone can look around inside a computer-generated environment. The graphics are primitive. The experience is brief, but something profound has happened. The boundary between human consciousness and artificial reality has been crossed. Users describe a strange sensation, a feeling of being somewhere else, even though they know they're standing in a laboratory. Their brains, evolved over millions of years to interpret visual information, are being gently fooled by patterns of light into believing in a world that exists only as mathematical equations. This was the birth of what we now call presence, the psychological phenomenon where your brain accepts a virtual environment as a real place. It's not just about seeing computer graphics. It's about feeling like you're actually there, like the virtual space has genuine spatial reality. Sutherland's system could only display simple wireframe cubes and pyramids, but users reported feeling like they could reach out and touch these objects, like they had genuine three-dimensional presence. The brain's spatial processing systems were being activated by pure mathematics. Around the same time, in training centers and military bases, flight simulators are evolving from mechanical contraptions into digital dreams. The Link trainer, which had been used to train pilots since the 1930s, was being transformed by computer technology. Early flight simulators were purely mechanical. They used pneumatic systems and mechanical linkages to simulate the motion of aircraft. The instruments were real aircraft instruments, connected to the simulator's mechanical systems. The view outside was often just a simple model landscape that moved past the cockpit windows. But as computers became more powerful, these simulators began to incorporate digital elements, computer-generated instrument displays, digital flight models that could simulate complex aircraft behavior, and eventually, computer-generated visual systems that could create entire artificial worlds. Pilots climb into these simulators and find themselves flying through worlds that never existed. Digital skies, computer-generated landscapes, simulated weather patterns. They're learning real skills in artificial environments, practicing maneuvers too dangerous to attempt in real aircraft. The line between simulation and reality is blurring, and everyone can feel it. A pilot learning to land in a crosswind, practicing the approach dozens of times in a simulator, develops real muscle memory, real skills, real confidence. The fact that the crosswind exists only as computer code doesn't make the learning less valuable or the skills less real. This was a profound insight. Artificial experiences could have real consequences. Virtual training could develop genuine expertise. Simulated practice could improve actual performance. What's remarkable about this early period is how quickly dreams became reality. The same mathematical techniques used to simulate nuclear reactions are being adapted to create training environments. Design tools, entertainment systems, weather prediction systems began using similar Monte Carlo methods to simulate atmospheric behavior. Engineers started using computer graphics to visualize complex designs before building them. Researchers began creating mathematical models of biological systems, economic markets, social networks. But perhaps most importantly, these early pioneers are discovering something beautiful about human perception. Our brains don't distinguish between real and artificial experiences based on their source. They distinguish based on the quality and consistency of the sensory input. A pilot in a flight simulator fully engaged in landing a virtual aircraft in a digital storm, experiences real stress, real concentration, real learning. The fact that the storm exists only as computer code doesn't make the experience less meaningful. This insight is profound. Consciousness doesn't care about the substrate of experience. What matters is not whether something is made of atoms or bits, but whether it engages our senses and our minds in meaningful ways. The implications were staggering. If artificial experiences could be as meaningful as real ones, if virtual environments could evoke genuine emotions and develop real skills, then the distinction between real and artificial might be less important than anyone had imagined. By the end of the 1960s, the foundation has been laid. Computers can create artificial worlds. Humans can interact with those worlds. And most importantly, our brains can be convinced, at least partially, that those artificial worlds are real. The stage is set for the next great leap, making those artificial worlds not just functional, but beautiful. In 1972, in a quiet laboratory at the University of Utah, a young man named Ed Catmull was working on something that would change the world, not through grand gestures or dramatic announcements, but through the simple act of digitizing his own left hand. Picture him there, carefully measuring a plaster cast he'd made of his hand, taking precise measurements, converting curves and surfaces into numbers, translating the familiar into the mathematical. Catmull was part of a remarkable generation of computer graphics pioneers at the University of Utah. The university had become a magnet for brilliant minds interested in the intersection of mathematics, art, and technology. Students and faculty worked together in an atmosphere of creative experimentation, pushing the boundaries of what computers could create. The process of digitizing his hand was painstaking. He had to measure hundreds of points on the surface, recording their three-dimensional coordinates. Then he had to figure out how to connect these points into a mathematical surface that the computer could understand and manipulate. When he finally rendered his hand on a computer screen, viewers saw something they had never seen before. A realistic representation of a human hand that existed only as mathematics, not a photograph, not a drawing, but a hand made of pure information, yet undeniably real-looking. The image was crude by today's standards, a simple wireframe model with basic shading, but it represented something revolutionary. For the first time, a computer had created a recognizable representation of a complex organic form. The boundary between the mathematical and the visual had been crossed. That digital hand would become famous as one of the first pieces of computer animation ever created. But it represented something much more profound, a fundamental shift in how we thought about the relationship between reality and representation. This wasn't just a technical achievement, it was a philosophical breakthrough. Catmull had demonstrated that the essence of an object, its shape, its form, its visual character, could be captured in pure mathematics and then reconstructed as light patterns on a screen. The 1970s were the gentle dawn of the computer graphics revolution. In research labs scattered across universities and technology companies, small groups of visionaries were working on a problem that seemed almost impossibly difficult. How do you make computers create images that can fool the human eye? The challenge was immense. Human vision is incredibly sophisticated, evolved over millions of years to detect the subtlest details of light and shadow. Our brains are exquisitely tuned to recognize when something looks wrong, when shadows fall in impossible directions, when surfaces reflect light in unnatural ways. our visual system can detect inconsistencies that we can't even consciously identify. A shadow that's slightly the wrong color. A reflection that doesn't quite match the surface it's supposed to be reflecting from. Motion that doesn't follow the physics we unconsciously expect. Early computer graphics were necessarily simple. The computers of the 1970s could barely handle basic calculations, let alone the complex mathematics required for realistic imagery. A single frame of computer graphics might require millions of calculations. Each pixel had to be computed individually, its color determined by complex interactions of light, surface properties, and viewing angle. The computational requirements were staggering. So, pioneers started with the basics. Wireframe models that showed the mathematical skeleton of three-dimensional objects. White lines floating in black space, defining the edges of cubes, spheres, and more complex shapes. These wireframe worlds had their own stark beauty. Mathematical perfection. Every line exactly where it should be. Every angle precisely calculated. Every perspective geometrically correct. There was something almost mystical about these early wireframe graphics. They revealed the mathematical structure underlying all visual form. They showed that complex shapes could be reduced to simple geometric relationships, that the visual world could be understood as pure mathematics made visible. But the researchers weren't satisfied with wireframes. They wanted to fill in those mathematical skeletons with surfaces, with colors, with the gentle play of light and shadow that makes objects look solid and real. The breakthrough came with something called raster graphics, the technique of building images pixel by pixel, like a mosaic made of tiny colored squares. This was a fundamental shift in how computers created images. Instead of drawing lines and curves, they would fill in areas with color, creating the illusion of solid surfaces. Each pixel became a tiny tile in an enormous mosaic. Each pixel was like a single tile in an enormous mosaic. By controlling the color of each individual pixel, programmers could create images of unprecedented complexity and realism. But this approach came with a cost. The computational requirements were enormous. A single image might contain hundreds of thousands of pixels, each requiring its own calculations for color, brightness, and position. A typical computer graphics image of the 1970s might contain 512 by 512 pixels, over 250,000 individual points of color. Each pixel's color had to be calculated based on the geometry of the scene, the properties of the surfaces, the position and color of light sources, and the viewing angle. In 1974, Ed Catmull published a paper that would become legendary. He described something called texture mapping, a way to wrap detailed images around simple three-dimensional shapes, like wrapping a photograph around a cylinder. The idea was elegantly simple, but computationally complex. Instead of trying to model every detail of a surface geometrically, you could take a photograph or drawing of the surface and mathematically wrap it around a simple geometric shape. Suddenly, a simple geometric cube could be transformed into a wooden crate, a brick wall, or a piece of marble, just by mapping the appropriate texture onto its surfaces. The mathematics remained simple, but the visual result could be incredibly complex and realistic. Texture mapping solved a fundamental problem in computer graphics: how to create visual complexity without computational complexity. A single photograph could provide the visual detail that would otherwise require millions of geometric calculations. Meanwhile, other researchers were tackling the problem of light itself. How do you simulate the way light bounces off surfaces, creates shadows, reflects in mirrors, refracts through glass? Light behavior in the real world is incredibly complex. Light doesn't just travel in straight lines from sources to surfaces. It bounces off surfaces, illuminating other surfaces. It passes through transparent materials, bending and changing color. It creates complex patterns of illumination that our eyes interpret as depth, texture, and material properties. The answer came through something called ray tracing. The idea was elegantly simple. For each pixel in the final image, trace the path of light backwards from the viewer's eye to the light sources. Calculate how that light would bounce off surfaces, pass through transparent materials, create the complex patterns of illumination we see in the real world. Ray tracing was based on a beautiful insight. Light follows predictable mathematical paths. By tracing these paths backwards from the eye to the light sources, you could calculate exactly what color each pixel should be to create a perfectly realistic image. Ray tracing could create images of stunning realism, perfect reflections, accurate shadows, realistic transparency. But it came with a price. The computational cost was enormous. A single image might take hours or even days to render. Each pixel might require tracing dozens or hundreds of light rays. Each ray might bounce off multiple surfaces before reaching a light source. The mathematical calculations involved were staggering, requiring the most powerful computers available. But the results were worth the wait. Ray-traced images had a quality of realism that had never been achieved before. Reflections were perfect. Shadows were accurate. Transparent objects looked genuinely transparent. The images had a photographic quality that was almost indistinguishable from reality. By the 1980s, computer graphics had reached a beautiful crossroads. The techniques existed to create photorealistic images, but the computers were still too slow to do it in real time. This created two paths. One focused on creating the most realistic images possible, regardless of how long they took to compute. The other focused on creating images that were good enough to be convincing, but could be generated fast enough for interactive use. The first path led to the revolution in movie special effects. Companies like Industrial Light and Magic began using computer graphics to create impossible scenes. Spaceships flying through asteroid fields, dinosaurs walking among live actors, entire worlds that existed only in computer memory. Movies like Star Wars and Tron showcased the potential of computer graphics to create images that were impossible to film with traditional cameras. Audiences were amazed by spaceships that moved with perfect precision, by light cycles racing through digital landscapes, by creatures that had never existed but looked completely real. The second path led to the revolution in interactive entertainment. Video games evolved from simple patterns of colored squares to complex, three-dimensional worlds that players could explore in real time. Early video games had been limited to simple geometric shapes and basic colors. But as graphics hardware improved, games began to feature more complex visuals. Characters became more detailed. Environments became more realistic. The line between games and interactive movies began to blur. But perhaps the most significant development was the gradual realization that photorealism wasn't always the goal. Sometimes stylized graphics could be more effective than realistic ones. This insight came from artists and designers who understood that visual communication isn't just about accuracy, It's about emotion, meaning, and aesthetic appeal. Sometimes, a stylized representation could convey more feeling than a photorealistic one. Pixar, the company that Ed Catmull co-founded, became masters of this approach. Their early short films didn't try to look exactly like reality. Instead, they created their own visual language, one that was clearly artificial but emotionally compelling. Films like Luxo Jr. featured characters that were obviously computer-generated, a desk lamp and a ball, but they moved and behaved in ways that made audiences care about them. The animation wasn't realistic, but it was expressive, charming, and emotionally engaging. When Pixar released Toy Story in 1995, it wasn't just the first fully computer-animated feature film. It was proof that artificial worlds could be just as emotionally engaging as real ones, perhaps even more so. The film's visual style was clearly artificial. The characters were obviously computer-generated. The environments were unmistakably digital, but none of that mattered to audiences. They fell in love with Woody and Buzz. They cared about their adventures. They were moved by their friendship. Children around the world fell in love with characters that existed only as mathematical equations, living in environments that were pure computation. Yet the emotions were real. The connections were genuine. This was a profound realization. The power of computer graphics wasn't just in creating realistic images. It was in creating meaningful experiences, in telling stories, in evoking emotions, in creating connections between audiences and characters that existed only as patterns of light. The graphics revolution had achieved something remarkable. It had created a new form of reality, not a replacement for physical reality, but a parallel reality, one that could be shaped by human imagination, unconstrained by the laws of physics, yet convincing enough to engage our emotions and our senses. But creating convincing visual worlds was only half the challenge. To make artificial realities truly believable, they needed to behave like real worlds. They needed to follow the gentle laws of physics. Imagine dropping a ball in your living room right now. It falls gently through the air, bounces softly on the floor, rolls to a quiet stop. Your mind processes this sequence without conscious thought because it follows the physical laws you've understood intuitively since childhood. But this simple sequence involves incredibly complex physics. The ball's trajectory is affected by air resistance. The bounce depends on the elasticity of both the ball and the floor. The rolling motion involves rotational inertia, surface friction, and energy dissipation. Your brain processes all of this instantly, unconsciously. Now imagine trying to teach a computer to simulate that same gentle action. Suddenly, what seemed effortless becomes incredibly complex. The computer needs to understand gravity, collision detection, momentum, friction, elasticity. It needs to calculate the ball's position 60 times per second, updating its trajectory based on forces that exist only as mathematical equations. This was the beautiful challenge that faced computer graphics pioneers in the 1980s and 1990s. They had learned to create stunning images, but those images were frozen in time. To create truly convincing artificial worlds, they needed to make those worlds move, behave, and respond according to the gentle laws of physics. The challenge was more than just technical. It was philosophical. What does it mean for a digital object to have weight, momentum, or elasticity? How do you translate the continuous, analog nature of physical forces into the discrete, digital world of computer calculations? The first physics simulations were simple, but revolutionary. In early video games, objects moved in straight lines until they hit something. Then they stopped or bounced in predetermined ways. There was no gravity, no momentum, no realistic collision response. A ball might bounce off a wall at exactly the same angle every time, regardless of how fast it was moving or what it was made of. These early simulations were crude, but they had a profound effect on players. Even simple, unrealistic physics could create a sense of cause and effect, of action and consequence, that made virtual worlds feel more real and engaging. But even these simple simulations had a profound effect on players. When a digital ball bounced in a way that felt right, even if it wasn't perfectly accurate, players' brains accepted it as real. The key insight was beautiful in its simplicity. Physics simulation didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to be consistent and believable. This was a crucial discovery. Perfect physical accuracy wasn't necessary for convincing simulation. What mattered was consistency. Objects should behave the same way in similar circumstances, and believability. The behavior should match players' intuitive expectations. The breakthrough came with the development of physics engines, specialized software systems designed to simulate the behavior of objects in virtual worlds. Physics engines were like translators between the continuous world of physical forces and the discrete world of digital computation. They took the smooth analog nature of real physics and converted it into step-by-step calculations that computers could perform. One of the pioneers in this field was a programmer named Chris Hecker. He realized that the key to convincing physics wasn't perfect accuracy, but what he called believable approximation. Hecker understood that players didn't need to see every detail of how objects interacted. They just needed to see enough detail to maintain the gentle illusion. This insight came from studying how human perception works. Our brains don't process every detail of physical interactions. Instead, they look for patterns, for consistency, for behavior that matches our expectations. A physics simulation could be quite inaccurate in detail while still feeling completely convincing. Consider the challenge of simulating cloth. In the real world, a piece of fabric is made up of millions of individual fibers, each interacting with its neighbors through complex molecular forces. Simulating this level of detail would require more computational power than existed on Earth. So programmers developed clever approximations. They represented cloth as a network of connected points, like a fishing net. Each point was connected to its neighbors by virtual springs. When forces acted on the cloth, wind, gravity, collision with other objects, the springs would stretch and compress, creating realistic-looking motion. This spring mass model was a brilliant simplification. It captured the essential behavior of cloth, its flexibility, its response to forces, its tendency to wrinkle and fold, without trying to simulate every individual fiber. The result wasn't physically perfect, but it was visually convincing. A digital cape could flutter in the wind. A virtual flag could wave realistically. And audiences accepted these simulations as real because they behaved in ways that matched their expectations. This approach, finding the essential characteristics of physical behavior and approximating them with simpler mathematical models, became the foundation of all physics simulation in computer graphics. As computers became more powerful, physics simulations became more sophisticated. Rigid body dynamics allowed objects to tumble and collide realistically. Fluid simulation made it possible to create convincing water, smoke, and fire. Rigid body dynamics dealt with objects that don't deform, things like rocks, cars, or furniture. These objects could rotate, translate, and collide, but they maintained their shape. The mathematics were complex but manageable, involving concepts like angular momentum, rotational inertia, and conservation of energy. Fluid simulation was much more challenging. Fluids are continuous media. Every point in a fluid can move independently. Simulating this required dividing the fluid into small elements and calculating how each element interacted with its neighbors. Particle systems could simulate everything from falling snow to exploding debris. Particle systems were particularly elegant because they could simulate complex collective behavior from simple individual rules. Each particle followed basic laws of motion, but when thousands of particles interacted, complex patterns emerged: swirling smoke, cascading water, swarms of insects. But perhaps the most important development was the realization that physics simulation wasn't just about making things look real. It was about making them feel real. When a player in a video game picks up a virtual object, the way that object responds to their actions determines whether the experience feels authentic or artificial. This led to the development of haptic feedback systems, technologies that let users feel virtual objects through touch. When you pick up a virtual ball, the controller might vibrate gently. When you hit a virtual wall, you might feel subtle resistance. These gentle sensory cues help convince your brain that the virtual world has physical substance, that it's not just visual, but tangible. The physics revolution also revealed something fascinating about human perception. Our brains are remarkably good at detecting when something moves in an unnatural way, even if we can't consciously identify what's wrong. A character whose clothing doesn't move properly, a ball that bounces at the wrong angle. These subtle errors can break the illusion of reality, even when everything else is perfect. This sensitivity to physical incorrectness is probably evolutionary. Our ancestors needed to quickly assess whether objects were behaving normally or dangerously. A rock that bounced strangely might indicate a trap. Water that flowed uphill might signal supernatural danger. This led to what researchers called the uncanny valley of physics simulation. Just as almost realistic human faces can seem unsettling, almost realistic physics can feel wrong in ways that are hard to articulate. Sometimes, stylized or simplified physics actually feels more natural than attempts at perfect realism. This was another crucial insight. Just as with visual realism, perfect physical accuracy wasn't always the goal. Sometimes, exaggerated or stylized physics could be more engaging than realistic physics. Cartoon physics, with its impossible bounces and gravity-defying leaps, could be more fun than realistic physics. Modern physics engines like Havok, PhysX, and Bullet can simulate incredibly complex interactions in real time. They can handle thousands of objects colliding simultaneously, simulate realistic vehicle dynamics, create convincing destruction effects. These engines represent decades of research and development. They incorporate sophisticated algorithms for collision detection, constraint solving, and numerical integration. They can simulate everything from the flight of a bullet to the collapse of a building. Video games today feature worlds where every object obeys consistent physical laws, where explosions scatter debris realistically, where characters move with natural-looking weight and momentum. Players can stack objects, build structures, create chain reactions of colliding objects. The physics simulation creates emergent gameplay, situations that the game designers never explicitly programmed, but that arise naturally from the interaction of physical laws. But the real achievement of physics simulation isn't technical, it's psychological. These systems have learned to speak the language that our brains use to understand the physical world. They create artificial experiences that feel authentic because they follow the same gentle rules that govern our everyday reality. When you watch a character in a modern video game or animated film, you're not just seeing pixels arranged in patterns. You're seeing the result of thousands of calculations per second, simulating gravity, momentum, collision, friction. You're watching mathematics pretend to be physics so convincingly that your brain accepts it as real. And this brings us to a profound realization. If we can simulate physics convincingly enough, if we can create artificial worlds that behave according to consistent rules, then perhaps the distinction between real and simulated physics isn't as important as we once thought. What matters isn't the substrate, whether forces are created by atoms or algorithms. What matters is whether they create experiences that feel meaningful and authentic. But as our simulations became more realistic, we encountered a new challenge, one that would prove to be one of the most unsettling discoveries in the field of artificial reality. In 1970, in a quiet laboratory in Japan, a roboticist named Masahiro Mori was working on a gentle puzzle. He wanted to make robots more appealing to humans, more friendly, more approachable. Mori was part of a generation of Japanese researchers who believed that robots could become companions to humans, not just tools. He envisioned a future where robots would work alongside people, help care for the elderly, and become integrated into daily life. But as he studied people's reactions to increasingly human-like robots, he noticed something strange, something unexpected. As robots became more human-like, people's comfort with them didn't improve steadily. Instead, there was a point where almost human robots became deeply unsettling, even frightening, in ways that obviously mechanical robots never were. Mori called this phenomenon Bukimi no Tani, the uncanny valley. He drew a gentle curve, showing how human comfort with robots increased as they became more human-like, but then suddenly plunged into a valley of unease when they became almost, but not quite, human. The graph was simple but profound. On one side were obviously mechanical robots, industrial arms, simple wheeled machines. People felt neutral about these. They were clearly tools, clearly artificial, and posed no psychological challenge. On the other side were perfectly human-like robots, indistinguishable from real people. Mori theorized that people would be comfortable with these too, once they became truly convincing. But in between was the valley. Robots that looked almost human, but not quite, that moved almost naturally, but with subtle wrongness, that spoke almost convincingly, but with slight artificiality. These robots triggered deep unease, even revulsion. At the time, Mori was thinking about physical robots, but his insight would prove to be even more relevant to the world of computer graphics and virtual reality. As digital humans became more realistic, they too would fall into this strange valley of unease. The first hints of the digital uncanny valley appeared in the 1980s as computer animators began creating more realistic human characters. Early digital humans were clearly artificial, simple geometric shapes with basic textures. They didn't look real, but they didn't need to. Audiences accepted them as stylized representations. There was something charming about their obvious artificiality. These early digital characters had a cartoon-like quality that was actually appealing. They were clearly not trying to be realistic, so audiences didn't judge them by realistic standards. They were evaluated as artistic creations, not as attempts to fool the eye. But as technology improved, animators began pushing toward greater realism. They added more detailed facial features, more sophisticated skin textures, more natural-looking hair. The motivation was understandable. Better technology seemed to demand more realistic results. If you could create more detailed characters, why wouldn't you? The assumption was that more realistic would always be better. And something strange began to happen. The more realistic these digital humans became, the more uncomfortable audiences felt watching them. The problem wasn't that they looked bad. Quite the opposite. They looked almost right, almost human, but not quite. And that not quite triggered something deep in human psychology. Something that made viewers feel uneasy without being able to explain why. The uncanny valley became particularly noticeable in early attempts at photorealistic computer animation. Films like Final Fantasy, The Spirits Within, featured digital humans that were technically impressive but emotionally disturbing. The film was a technical marvel. The characters had detailed skin textures, realistic hair that moved naturally, and facial features that were anatomically correct. The animation was smooth and sophisticated. By all technical measures, it should have been a triumph. Audiences described the characters as creepy, lifeless, zombie-like, even though they couldn't pinpoint exactly what was wrong. The film was a commercial failure, and many blamed the uncanny valley effect. Audiences simply couldn't connect emotionally with characters that looked almost human but felt somehow wrong. Researchers began studying this phenomenon, trying to understand what made almost human faces so unsettling. They discovered that human brains are incredibly sensitive to facial features and expressions. We're evolutionarily programmed to read faces for signs of emotion, intention, health, and social status. When a face looks almost right but has subtle errors, eyes that don't quite track properly, skin that doesn't move naturally, expressions that don't match the voice, our brains detect these inconsistencies and interpret them as signs of sickness, death, or deception. This makes evolutionary sense. Throughout human history, the ability to quickly assess whether someone was healthy, trustworthy, or dangerous was crucial for survival. Faces that looked almost normal but had subtle wrongness might indicate disease, mental illness, or deception. Our brains are wired to be suspicious of faces that don't quite look right. This ancient survival mechanism was being triggered by digital characters that fell into the uncanny valley. The uncanny valley wasn't just about visual appearance. It extended to movement, voice, and behavior. A digital character might look perfectly human in a still image, but the moment it began to move or speak, subtle errors in animation would trigger that sense of unease. The way light reflected off digital skin, the way virtual muscles moved beneath the surface, the timing of blinks and micro-expressions. All of these had to be perfect, or the illusion would collapse into something disturbing. Human movement is incredibly complex and subtle. We unconsciously process thousands of tiny details. The way weight shifts during walking, the micro-expressions that flicker across faces, the subtle asymmetries that make movement look natural. Digital characters that got most of these details right, but missed a few key elements, would trigger the uncanny valley response. They would look almost human, but move in ways that felt subtly wrong. This created a beautiful paradox for computer graphics artists. The better they became at creating realistic humans, the more likely they were to fall into the uncanny valley. Sometimes, a less realistic but more stylized character would be more appealing than a technically superior but slightly imperfect one. This paradox forced artists and technologists to think more carefully about their goals. Was photorealism always the right target? Or were there other approaches that might be more effective? Pixar made a conscious decision to avoid the uncanny valley entirely. Instead of pursuing photorealism, they developed a distinctive visual style that was clearly artificial but emotionally engaging. Their characters were obviously not human, but they were designed to be appealing and expressive within their own visual language. Pixar's approach was based on the principles of traditional animation. Characters were designed to be readable, expressive, and appealing rather than realistic. Proportions were exaggerated for emotional effect. Movements were stylized to enhance personality and mood. The result was characters that audiences could connect with emotionally, even though they were obviously artificial. Woody and Buzz from Toy Story were clearly computer-generated, but they had personality, charm, and emotional depth that made audiences care about them. Other studios took the opposite approach, pushing through the uncanny valley toward perfect realism. Companies like Weta Digital invested enormous resources in perfecting every detail of digital human appearance and behavior. This approach required incredible attention to detail. Every aspect of human appearance and movement had to be studied, understood, and replicated. Skin had to have the right translucency. Hair had to move with proper physics. Eyes had to track and focus realistically. The breakthrough came with the realization that the uncanny valley wasn't just a technical problem, it was a perceptual one. The solution wasn't just better graphics, but better understanding of human psychology and perception. Motion capture technology played a crucial role in crossing the valley. Instead of animating digital characters by hand, artists began recording the movements and expressions of real actors, then transferring that data to digital characters. This preserved the subtle, unconscious details of human movement that are impossible to recreate artificially. Motion capture could record not just the obvious movements, arms, legs, head, but also the tiny micro-movements that make human motion look natural. The slight sway of the torso during walking, the tiny adjustments in balance, the unconscious gestures that accompany speech. Andy Serkis, the actor who played Gollum in the Lord of the Rings films, became famous as a pioneer of performance capture. His physical performance was recorded and used to drive a digital character, creating a beautiful hybrid of human authenticity and digital flexibility. Serkis brought not just his movements to the character, but his understanding of acting, his emotional intelligence, his ability to create a believable personality. The technology captured his performance, but the artistry was entirely human. The result was a character that felt genuinely alive, even though it existed only as computer graphics. Gollum was a breakthrough because he successfully crossed the uncanny valley. Audiences accepted him as a real character, not as a technical demonstration. They cared about his story, feared his madness, and were moved by his tragedy. But the uncanny valley revealed something deeper about the nature of artificial reality. It showed that our brains don't just passively receive sensory information, they actively interpret it, looking for patterns, inconsistencies, and meaning. When those interpretive systems detect something that doesn't quite fit their expectations, They trigger emotional responses that can be powerful and disturbing. This has profound implications for virtual reality and artificial intelligence. As we create more sophisticated artificial beings and environments, we need to understand not just how to make them technically accurate, but how to make them psychologically acceptable. We need to speak the language of human perception, not just the language of physics and mathematics. The uncanny valley also raises beautiful questions about the nature of humanity itself. What is it about human appearance and behavior that is so distinctive? What makes us recognize something as human or not human? These questions become more pressing as artificial intelligence becomes more sophisticated. If we can create artificial beings that think, learn, and communicate like humans, what makes them different from us? Is it their substrate, silicon instead of carbon, or is it something more fundamental? And what does it mean when we can create artificial beings that are indistinguishable from real ones? Today, we're seeing the emergence of digital humans that successfully cross the uncanny valley. Characters in modern films and video games can be virtually indistinguishable from real actors. Movies like Avatar and The Jungle Book feature digital characters that audiences accept as completely real. The technology has advanced to the point where the uncanny valley can be crossed consistently and reliably. Virtual influencers on social media have millions of followers who engage with them as if they were real people. Characters like Lil Miquela and Shudu have built massive followings on Instagram and other platforms. Their followers know they're artificial, but they engage with them emotionally, following their lives and caring about their experiences. But this success brings new challenges. If we can create artificial humans that are indistinguishable from real ones, how do we maintain trust in visual media? How do we preserve the concept of authentic human expression when that expression can be perfectly simulated? These questions are becoming increasingly urgent as deepfake technology becomes more sophisticated. If anyone can create convincing videos of anyone else saying or doing anything, how do we distinguish truth from fiction? The uncanny valley was never just about making better graphics. It was about understanding the boundary between artificial and authentic, between simulation and reality. And as that boundary becomes increasingly blurred, we find ourselves facing the same questions that philosophers have been asking for thousands of years. How do we know what's real? In 1984, in a cluttered garage in California, a young dreamer named Jaron Lanier was surrounded by cables, circuit boards, and half-assembled electronic devices. Lanier was trying to solve a problem that had fascinated him since childhood. How could technology allow people to share experiences directly, to step inside each other's imagination, to see the world through different eyes? Lanier was an unusual figure in the technology world. Part scientist, part artist, part philosopher, he played exotic musical instruments, wrote poetry, and thought deeply about the relationship between technology and human consciousness. His garage workshop looked like something from a mad scientist's laboratory. Oscilloscopes and soldering irons shared space with musical instruments and art supplies. Half-finished inventions covered every surface. The air smelled of solder and possibility. Lanier's solution was revolutionary. He founded a company called VPL Research and began developing what he would call virtual reality. The term itself was Lanier's invention, and it captured something that had never existed before. Artificially created environments that could completely surround and immerse a human being. The name was carefully chosen. Virtual suggested something that had the essence or effect of reality without being physically real. Reality emphasized that this wasn't just about graphics or games, but about creating genuine experiences that could feel as meaningful as physical reality. VPL's first products were crude but magical. The data glove could track the movement of a user's hand and fingers, translating gentle gestures into digital commands. The iPhone, a bulky headset that looked like something from a science fiction dream, could display simple three-dimensional graphics that surrounded the user's field of vision. The data glove was a marvel of engineering for its time. It used fiber optic sensors to detect the bending of each finger joint. When you moved your hand, the glove would translate those movements into digital signals that could control virtual objects. The iPhone was even more ambitious. It contained two small LCD screens, one for each eye, that could display stereoscopic 3D images. Head tracking sensors detected when you moved your head, allowing the virtual world to update in real time. When you put on VPL's virtual reality system, you entered a world of simple geometric shapes floating in digital space. You could reach out with the data glove and gently grab virtual objects, move them around, reshape them with your hands. It was primitive by today's standards, but for the first time in human history, you could step inside a computer-generated world and interact with it as if it were real. The graphics were simple wireframe objects in basic colors. The resolution was low. The frame rate was choppy. But none of that mattered to the people who experienced it. They were witnessing the birth of a new medium. The experience was transformative for those who tried it. Users described a sense of presence, of actually being somewhere else. Even though they knew they were standing in a laboratory, wearing electronic equipment, their brains, presented with consistent visual and tactile feedback, accepted the artificial environment as a real place. This was the first time that presence, the psychological phenomenon of feeling like you're actually in a virtual space, had been achieved reliably. Users reported that after a few minutes in the virtual world, they would forget about the physical world around them. But virtual reality in the 1980s and 1990s was limited by the gentle constraints of technology. The computers were too slow to generate convincing graphics in real time. The displays flickered noticeably. The tracking systems were imprecise. The computational requirements were staggering. Generating even simple 3D graphics in real time required enormous processing power. The computers of the 1980s could barely handle basic calculations, let alone the complex mathematics required for immersive virtual worlds, and the equipment was enormously expensive. A complete VR system could cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. This made VR accessible only to research institutions, major corporations, and government agencies. Consumer VR seemed like an impossible dream. Despite these limitations, VR captured the imagination of researchers, artists, and futurists. Here was technology that seemed to offer unlimited possibilities. Virtual worlds where the laws of physics could be rewritten, where people could take on different identities, where impossible experiences could become real. Science fiction writers and filmmakers began exploring the implications of virtual reality. Movies like Tron and The Lawnmower Man imagined worlds where people could live entirely in digital spaces. Novels like Neuromancer described cyberspace as a parallel reality where consciousness could exist independently of the physical body. But by the late 1990s, virtual reality had largely faded from public consciousness. The technology couldn't deliver on its promises. The experiences were often disappointing, causing motion sickness and eye strain. The problem was that the technology had been overhyped. Early demonstrations of VR promised experiences that the hardware simply couldn't deliver. Users expected photorealistic graphics and seamless interaction, but got low-resolution wireframes and clunky interfaces. VR entered what researchers now call the first winter, a period when interest and investment dried up, and the technology seemed to be a beautiful dream that would never be realized. The term VR winter was borrowed from artificial intelligence, which had experienced similar cycles of hype and disappointment. Technologies that promised revolutionary changes often went through these cycles. Initial excitement, overhyping, disappointment, and then gradual, steady progress. For nearly 2 decades, virtual reality remained primarily in research laboratories and specialized applications. Military organizations used VR for training simulations. Medical schools used it to teach anatomy. Architects used it to let clients walk through buildings before they were constructed. These applications were successful because they had specific, practical goals. Military flight simulators didn't need to be entertaining. They just needed to provide realistic training. Medical education applications didn't need to be comfortable for hours of use. They just needed to teach anatomy effectively. But consumer VR seemed like a dream that would never come true. Then, in 2012, a young inventor named Palmer Luckey launched a crowdfunding campaign for something called the Oculus Rift. Luckey had been building VR headsets in his garage, much like Jaron Lanier had done 30 years earlier. Luckey was part of a new generation of VR enthusiasts who had grown up with video games and were frustrated by the limitations of traditional displays. He wanted to create truly immersive gaming experiences that would make players feel like they were actually inside virtual worlds. But Luckey had advantages that earlier pioneers didn't have. Smartphones had driven the development of small, higher-resolution displays and precise motion sensors. Graphics processors had become powerful enough to render convincing 3D worlds in real time. The smartphone revolution had been crucial for VR. Millions of phones needed small, higher-resolution screens, which drove down costs and improved quality. They also needed accelerometers and gyroscopes for motion sensing, which made these sensors cheap and reliable. And manufacturing techniques had advanced to the point where VR equipment could be produced affordably. The Oculus Rift Kickstarter campaign raised over $2 million, proving that there was still enormous public interest in virtual reality. More importantly, it caught the attention of major technology companies. The campaign's success showed that consumers were ready for VR despite the disappointments of the past. The gaming community, in particular, was excited about the possibility of truly immersive experiences. Facebook acquired Oculus for $2 billion. Google, Apple, Microsoft, and Sony all began developing their own VR systems. Mark Zuckerberg's acquisition of Oculus was seen as a bold bet on the future of computing. He believed that VR would become the next major computing platform, following personal computers, the internet, and mobile devices. The new generation of VR was dramatically better than what had come before. The displays were sharp and bright, with no noticeable flicker. The tracking was precise, allowing users to move naturally within virtual spaces. Modern VR headsets used old displays with resolutions approaching that of human vision. The refresh rates were high enough to eliminate flicker and reduce motion sickness. Head tracking was accurate to fractions of a degree. The graphics were convincing enough to create a genuine sense of presence. And the cost had dropped to the point where consumers could afford to buy VR systems for their homes. A complete VR system that would have cost hundreds of thousands of dollars in the 1990s could now be purchased for a few $100s. This democratization of VR technology opened up entirely new possibilities. But perhaps more importantly, this new VR renaissance coincided with a broader shift in how we think about digital experiences. Social media had already accustomed people to the idea of living part of their lives in digital spaces. People were already spending hours each day in virtual environments, social media platforms, online games, video calls. The idea of more immersive digital experiences didn't seem strange or threatening. Smartphones had made it normal to carry powerful computers everywhere. Online gaming had created communities of people who spent significant time in virtual worlds. Virtual reality began to find applications that went far beyond entertainment. Therapists used VR to treat phobias and trauma, allowing patients to confront their fears in safe, controlled environments. VR therapy was particularly effective for treating PTSD in veterans. Patients could be gradually exposed to triggering situations in a controlled way, helping them process traumatic experiences and reduce their emotional impact. Educators used VR to take students on virtual field trips to ancient Rome, the bottom of the ocean, or the surface of Mars. Doctors used VR to practice complex surgeries before operating on real patients. Medical applications of VR were particularly promising. Surgeons could practice difficult procedures repeatedly in virtual environments. Medical students could explore 3D models of human anatomy. Patients could use VR for pain management and rehabilitation. But it was the social applications of VR that proved most intriguing. Platforms like Virtuit and Rec Room allowed people to meet and interact in virtual spaces, taking on digital avatars and engaging in activities that would be impossible in the physical world. Users reported forming genuine friendships and emotional connections with people they had never met in person, mediated entirely through their virtual representations. This was perhaps the most surprising development in modern VR. While many had expected VR to be primarily about entertainment or productivity, it turned out that social interaction was one of its most compelling applications. People could express themselves differently in virtual spaces. They could take on different appearances, explore different aspects of their personality, and connect with others in ways that felt more authentic than traditional online communication. This raised beautiful questions about the nature of social interaction and identity. If you can have meaningful relationships with people through virtual avatars, what does that say about the importance of physical presence? If you can express yourself more authentically through a digital representation than through your physical body, which version of you is more real? These questions became particularly relevant during the COVID-19 pandemic, when physical distancing made virtual interaction more important than ever. VR provided a way for people to feel connected and present with others, even when they couldn't be physically together. Augmented reality, AR, emerged as VR's gentle companion technology. Instead of replacing the real world with a virtual one, AR overlaid digital information onto physical reality. Smartphones could display virtual objects that appeared to exist in real space. AR glasses could provide information about the world around you, identifying objects, translating signs, or showing directions. AR represented a different philosophy from VR. Instead of escaping from reality, AR enhanced reality. Instead of replacing the physical world, it augmented it with digital information. The boundary between virtual and augmented reality began to blur. Mixed reality systems could seamlessly blend digital and physical objects, allowing users to interact with virtual elements that appeared to exist in real space. The distinction between real and artificial became increasingly meaningless as digital and physical experiences merged. Today, we stand at the threshold of what some call the metaverse, a persistent, shared virtual world where people can work, play, socialize, and create. Companies are investing billions of dollars in creating these virtual spaces. The metaverse concept represents the ultimate convergence of all the technologies we've discussed. Virtual worlds with realistic graphics and physics. Social spaces where people can interact through avatars. Persistent environments that continue to exist even when you're not there. Betting that they will become as important as the physical world for human interaction and commerce. But the metaverse raises the same questions that philosophers have been asking for millennia. If we spend significant portions of our lives in virtual worlds, if we form relationships and create value in digital spaces, then what does it mean to be real? Perhaps the answer is that reality was never about the substrate, whether something is made of atoms or bits. Perhaps reality is about experience, meaning, and connection. Perhaps the question isn't whether virtual worlds are real, but whether they help us become more fully human. And so we come to the gentle end of our journey through the evolution of simulated reality. From ancient caves to digital worlds, from Plato's prisoners watching shadows dance on stone walls, to modern explorers navigating virtual realms that feel as real as anything we've ever known. What have we discovered along this peaceful path? Perhaps that the questions our ancestors whispered by candlelight are the same questions we asked today, just with different tools and different contexts. The technology has changed dramatically, but the fundamental human desire to understand what is real, what is meaningful, and what it means to exist, that remains beautifully constant. We've seen how ancient philosophical insights drove technological innovation, how Plato's cave allegory anticipated virtual reality by over 2 millennia, how Descartes' evil demon prefigured the Matrix by centuries, how Eastern concepts of Maya and illusion parallel our modern understanding of perception and reality. We've witnessed the birth of artificial worlds in the laboratories of Los Alamos, where mathematicians first created realities made of pure information. We've followed the evolution of computer graphics from simple wireframes to photorealistic imagery that can fool the human eye. We've explored how physics engines learned to simulate the gentle laws of motion, collision, and force, creating virtual worlds that behave according to consistent rules. We've discovered that our brains don't distinguish between real and artificial experiences based on their source, but based on their quality and consistency. We've learned about the uncanny valley, that strange psychological phenomenon that reveals how sophisticated our perception really is. How careful we must be when creating artificial beings that approach human likeness. How sometimes stylized artificiality can be more appealing than imperfect realism. We've traced the journey of virtual reality from Jaron Lanier's garage experiments to today's consumer headsets. We've seen how VR went through cycles of hype and disappointment before finally delivering on its promises. We've explored how virtual worlds are becoming spaces for genuine social interaction, creative expression, and meaningful experience. But perhaps most importantly, we've discovered that the question, what is real, may be less important than we once thought. What matters isn't whether an experience is generated by atoms or algorithms, but whether it creates meaning, fosters connection, and helps us understand ourselves and each other. The prisoners in Plato's cave eventually learned that their shadow world was just one layer of a larger reality. Perhaps we too are discovering that physical reality is just one layer of a larger experiential reality, one that includes virtual worlds, digital relationships, and artificial experiences that are no less meaningful for being artificial. As we stand on the threshold of the metaverse, as we prepare to spend increasing portions of our lives in virtual spaces, we're not abandoning reality, we're expanding it. We're creating new layers of experience, new possibilities for connection, new ways of being human. The ancient philosophers who first questioned the nature of reality would, I think, be fascinated by our digital age. They would recognize in our virtual worlds the same questions they pondered by firelight. They would see in our artificial realities the same human desire to transcend the limitations of immediate experience. They would understand that whether we're watching shadows on a cave wall or exploring virtual worlds through VR headsets, we're engaged in the same fundamental human activity, trying to understand what it means to exist, to experience, to be real. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you'll dream of digital worlds and ancient caves, of shadows dancing on walls and pixels painting impossible realities, of the eternal human quest to understand consciousness, experience, and existence itself. In our next gentle journey, we'll continue exploring the Matrix Decoded series by diving deeper into the history of virtual reality itself. From Ivan Sutherland's first headset to the modern VR renaissance, we'll discover how dreams of digital escape have driven some of our most ambitious technological achievements. Until then, rest peacefully in whatever reality you call home. And remember, whether you're dreaming in a physical brain or processing in a digital simulation, the experience of consciousness, wonder, and curiosity remains beautifully, mysteriously real. Sweet dreams, gentle explorers of digital worlds. May your rest be filled with the quiet satisfaction of questions pondered and mysteries contemplated. May you wake refreshed and ready to continue the eternal human journey of discovery.